In a small town in Texas, nestled between rolling hills and fields that stretched for miles, the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the dusty roads. The smell of fresh rain lingered in the air after a short, heavy downpour. The town, which had only a few hundred residents, was quiet, except for the faint hum of cicadas in the trees and the occasional passing car. At the center of it all stood the humble yet imposing church, a structure made of aged red brick with a tall steeple that seemed to pierce the sky. The church was run by Reverend James Bennett, a man known to all as a pious leader with strong beliefs, a deep voice, and a presence that commanded respect. His sermons were fiery, and his words, laced with scripture, often left a mark on anyone who heard them. The Reverend had three sons, all of whom were growing up in the shadow of his strict expectations. The youngest, Daniel, was only 15, a boy with a sharp mind and rebellious streak that often clashed with his father's unyielding authority. Then there was Michael, 17, the older of the two, who had spent most of his time trying to stay out of his father's way. Despite their strained relationship, the boys were still family, and no matter how harsh his methods, James had always believed in the value of keeping them under control. The small house they lived in was only a stone's throw from the church, a modest dwelling with white painted wood and a porch that wrapped around the front. The house was always immaculate, an image of the Bennett family's adherence to cleanliness and order. But behind that facade there were cracks, invisible to the naked eye, that were starting to show. James had always been a man of conviction, his life devoted to God and the church. His faith was unshakable. But lately he'd begun to notice something strange in his sons. A distance had crept in between them, and their behavior seemed off. He found it difficult to pinpoint, but there were whispers in the town, rumors about his son's strange behavior. The Reverend couldn't afford to let these rumors linger. They threatened the sanctity of his family, the image he worked so hard to uphold. One evening, after a particularly long sermon, James decided he would confront his sons. It was time to get to the bottom of whatever was troubling them. He couldn't allow any hint of dishonor in his house, especially not after all the years he'd put into raising them. As he approached their bedroom, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He pushed the door open slowly, just enough to peek inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. His two sons were there, their pants down around their ankles, tangled in a way that no father should ever witness. The scene was not just an abomination in his eyes, it was a betrayal of everything he stood for. The sanctity of his home, the purity of his faith, had been shattered in an instant. His heart pounded in his chest and his breath came in shallow gasps. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as he stared at the two figures in front of him. They didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in what they were doing. But when they finally looked up, they froze. Fear flashed across their faces, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. Reverend James Bennett's rage boiled over in an instant. He saw nothing but sin, nothing but the breaking of all that he believed in. His mind raced with thoughts of punishment, of the need to rid his house of this evil. The words of the scripture that he had spent his life preaching seemed to echo in his head, urging him to act swiftly and decisively. "What have you done?" he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice low but filled with venom. His sons stood motionless, unable to speak, their faces pale with terror. They knew the consequences of their actions, the finality of their father's anger. They had broken the cardinal rule, and now they would pay the price. In the coming days, the town would learn that Reverend James Bennett's sons were dead. What had started as a quiet evening in a small town would soon turn into a story that would grip the entire community. The preacher, who had been a beacon of righteousness to everyone who knew him, had killed his sons in a fit of rage, or so it seemed. But there was more to the story than anyone could imagine. The investigation that would follow would reveal hidden truths and deep secrets, peeling back the layers of a seemingly perfect family to uncover the dark reality beneath. As the rain continued to fall outside the church that evening, Reverend James Bennett sat in his office, staring at the cold, hard floor, his mind racing with the gravity of what he had done. He had followed his convictions, his faith, but the weight of his actions threatened to consume him. Would the world understand? Would they ever see him the same way again? For now, all he could do was wait for the inevitable. The investigation would begin soon, and the truth would come to light. The morning after the tragedy, the town of Oak Ridge was abuzz with whispers and hushed conversations. The news of Reverend James Bennett's son's deaths spread like wildfire, and no one knew what to make of it. In a community that prided itself on its faith and traditions, such an act seemed impossible. The idea that a father, a man of God, could kill his own children was too shocking to comprehend. But the facts were undeniable. Two teenagers were dead, and their father, the revered preacher, was the only one left standing. As the sun rose over the town, the local sheriff, Roger Thompson, arrived at the Bennett household with his team of deputies. Sheriff Thompson was a seasoned investigator, a man who had seen his fair share of crime in the small town. But nothing prepared him for what he would find at the Bennett home. The house was eerily quiet, its pristine exterior hiding the horror that had unfolded within. The front door was slightly ajar, and as Thompson stepped inside, the smell of incense and old wood greeted him. The reverence that once filled the home seemed absent, replaced by a heavy tension in the air. "James," the sheriff called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to talk." Reverend Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes were downcast, his face pale, and his usually sharp features seemed drained of all color. He didn't look like the man who had once commanded the attention of an entire congregation. Now he appeared smaller, broken. The weight of his actions hung heavily on him. "I've been expecting you," Bennett said quietly, his voice hoarse. He didn't look up, but his words were steady. "I know what you're here for." Sheriff Thompson took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. The situation was delicate. He had to approach it carefully. "James, I know this is hard, but I need you to walk me through what happened." Bennett's shoulders sagged, as though the simple act of speaking would be too much for him. But after a long silence, he began to speak, his voice low and shaky. "I came home from the church last night, after my sermon. I knew something was wrong. I don't know what it was. Just a feeling. I went to their room, and that's when I saw them. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were together. I didn't know what to do. I just couldn't control myself. The Lord doesn't allow such things. I had to stop them. I had to." Sheriff Thompson listened carefully, his brow furrowing as he processed Bennett's words. The preacher was clearly distraught, but there was something in his tone that made Thompson pause. Was this just a case of a father driven to madness by his own beliefs, or was there something more to the story? "James," Thompson began, choosing his words carefully, "I need to know exactly what happened after you found them. You say you couldn't control yourself. But what do you mean by that?" Bennett's hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. "I don't know, Sheriff. It all happened so fast. I grabbed my gun. I didn't even think about it. I had to make it stop. It was wrong. I couldn't let it continue. I shot them both." The sheriff's stomach tightened as the full extent of what Bennett was confessing hit him. 2 lives had been taken, and it seemed that the preacher was admitting to it with chilling calmness. But something didn't sit right with Thompson. There were too many questions, too many holes in the story. Sheriff Thompson nodded slowly, keeping his voice even. "We'll need to examine the bodies, James. You understand that, right?" Bennett didn't respond immediately. His eyes glazed over, and for a moment, Thompson wondered if he had even heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I understand." The sheriff gestured for one of his deputies to call for an ambulance and began his walk through the house, inspecting the scene. The bedroom where the boys had been found was untouched, the bed still neatly made, and the room itself was quiet. Too quiet for something so violent to have occurred. As he examined the room, Sheriff Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the scene than met the eye. The walls were adorned with religious symbols, crosses, Bible verses, and framed pictures of saints and angels. There was nothing that seemed out of place until Thompson's gaze landed on the small dresser in the corner. There he noticed a small, folded note. It was tucked between the drawers, hidden as though someone had tried to keep it from view. He reached for it, carefully unfolding the paper. The words written on it sent a chill down his spine. It was a letter, but not just any letter. It was a confession that painted a Very different picture from what Reverend Bennett had just described. The letter read, "We didn't want to disappoint him. We knew what he would do if he found out. But we couldn't help it. We were in love. We couldn't stop what was happening between us. We're sorry, but we didn't know how to fix it. Please understand that we didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sheriff Thompson's heart raced as he carefully put the letter back where he had found it. Something about the words troubled him deeply. This wasn't just the rambling of a troubled mind. It was a desperate plea from the boys themselves. They had been caught in a situation they couldn't escape from, and they had tried to explain themselves. But it was too late now. The sheriff turned back to Bennett, who was still seated at the kitchen table, staring blankly ahead. "James," he said, his voice firm, "there's something you need to tell me. What exactly happened in that room? The boys left something behind that doesn't add up with your story." Bennett's face went pale. He swallowed hard but didn't respond. It was clear to Sheriff Thompson that the preacher knew exactly what he was being accused of, and he wasn't prepared to face the full weight of the truth. As Thompson began to piece together the evidence, one thing became clear. This was no simple crime of passion. There was a deeper, darker story at play, and it was a story that would shake the town to its core. Sheriff Thompson's mind raced as he stood in the Bennett family home, processing the gravity of what he had just uncovered. The letter from the boys, tucked away in the dresser, suggested a narrative far different from the one Reverend James Bennett had presented. The confession hinted at guilt, confusion, and fear, but it didn't fit with the calm, collected demeanor that Bennett had shown during the interrogation. The preacher had confessed to shooting his sons, but the words of the letter seemed to suggest that the boys had been trying to explain something deeper, something that might have led to their tragic deaths. The sheriff's job was to uncover the truth, and right now, there were too many inconsistencies in the story for him to ignore. He needed to dig deeper, talk to the people who had known the Bennetts, and piece together the puzzle that was slowly taking shape. But first, he needed to address Reverend Bennett. The preacher's confession, while chilling, didn't account for everything, especially not the emotions and the motivations that seemed to lurk beneath the surface. As Sheriff Thompson sat across from Reverend Bennett in the small, dimly lit kitchen, he could see the toll that the tragedy had taken on him. The preacher was sweating, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. He was a man undone by his own actions, but the sheriff suspected there was more to the story. James Bennett was hiding something that might explain his cold, calculated actions. "James," Thompson began, trying to remain calm but firm, "you've told me your side of the story, but there's more that I need to understand. I found a letter in your son's room. I need to know what this means." He slid the letter across the table, placing it in front of the preacher. Bennett's eyes immediately dropped to the paper. His face went ashen, and for a long moment he didn't speak. His fingers curled into tight fists, and his chest heaved as if he was struggling to breathe. I I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Thompson leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. This letter was written by your sons. They tried to explain themselves. They didn't want this to happen. What's going on here, James? What aren't you telling me?" Bennett's eyes darted to the window, as if seeking some sort of escape from the conversation. For a long time he said nothing, his lips pressed tight together. The sheriff knew that this was a breaking point. Reverend Bennett could either continue to lie, or he could come clean and face the consequences of his actions. "I didn't want it to happen like this," Bennett finally whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the words. "I didn't know what else to do. I had to stop them. I thought they were lost, that they were beyond saving." The devil had a hold of them. Thompson's mind raced as he tried to comprehend what the preacher was saying. The more Bennett spoke, the more it became clear that his actions were driven by something beyond simple anger. There was a deep, fundamental fear in his voice. Fear of losing control, fear of losing his sons to something he didn't understand, fear of damnation. They were together, Bennett continued, his voice trembling with emotion. And it wasn't just a phase. I knew it wasn't. They were involved in something unnatural, something that couldn't be forgiven. The Lord says that sin like that is the work of the devil. And I couldn't let them fall any further. The sheriff's gut twisted as he listened to Bennett's words. The preacher wasn't just condemning his son's actions, he was condemning their very existence. To him, this wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. It was a betrayal of everything he held dear, an affront to his faith so deep that it drove him to murder. I saw them together, Sheriff, Bennett said, his eyes wild with fear. I saw them in a way that no father should ever see his children. I had to stop it. I couldn't let them destroy themselves. So I made sure they wouldn't hurt anyone anymore. Thompson's heart sank. There it was, the chilling confession that had been buried beneath Bennett's stoic exterior. The preacher had believed that by killing his sons, he was saving them. He had seen his actions as righteous, as necessary for the salvation of their souls. But Sheriff Thompson wasn't convinced. There was something else at play here. It was one thing to be deeply religious, but another entirely to take matters into your own hands and murder your children. There had to be more to this, some deeper truth that Bennett was hiding. Thompson stood up, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. James, I need you to understand something. This isn't about your faith. This is about what you did to your sons. They were your responsibility. And whatever your beliefs told you, there's no excuse for what you did. Bennett looked up at him then, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. You don't understand, he muttered. I was trying to save them. I thought I was doing what was right. But Thompson was done listening to excuses. It was time to take action. We'll let the courts decide what's right, James. But for now, you're under arrest for the murder of your sons. The sheriff turned and walked toward the door, signaling for one of his deputies to step inside and take Bennett into custody. The preacher didn't resist. His shoulders slumped in defeat. But as he was led away, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something about this case wasn't over. There was more to uncover, more to understand. He needed to dig deeper, into the preacher's past, his relationship with his sons, and the events leading up to that fateful night. The investigation was far from over. And Sheriff Thompson knew that the truth, whatever it was, would not be easy to find. But he was determined to uncover it, no matter where it led. As the preacher was driven away, the sheriff stood in the quiet house, his mind racing. This was just the beginning of a much darker story, a story that would unravel the very fabric of this tight-knit community and reveal the hidden secrets that had been buried for years. The investigation was about to get even more complicated. The following day, Sheriff Thompson met with his team to review the evidence. The confession from Reverend James Bennett was chilling, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Bennett's explanation for his actions was disturbingly simple. His sons had strayed too far from what he believed was the righteous path. But there was something more lurking beneath the surface, something that Thompson was beginning to sense with a growing certainty. As the investigation progressed, the sheriff ordered a deeper examination of the Bennett family's past. He needed to understand not just what happened the night of the murders, but also what had led up to that fateful moment. There had to be a history, a pattern of behavior that had led Bennett to take such drastic, unforgivable measures. The first step was to interview the people who had known the Bennetts. The sheriff wanted to hear from the members of the congregation, friends, and even distant relatives. He needed to understand how the preacher had interacted with others and what people knew about his family dynamics. Sheriff Thompson arranged a meeting with Mrs. Janet Caldwell, a longtime member of the congregation who had known Reverend Bennett for years. Janet was an older woman, her face weathered with time but her eyes sharp and full of insight. She had attended the Bennett family's church for decades and was familiar with the preacher's personality and beliefs. I can't believe what's happened, Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice trembling as she sat across from the sheriff in her modest living room. I've known James for a long time. He was always such a devout man, a good preacher. He loved his boys, or at least that's what he said. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the way he treated them? Thompson asked, trying to sound as neutral as possible. Mrs. Caldwell paused, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her dress. Well, now that you mention it, there were always whispers about how strict he was with them. The boys, they were different. They didn't seem to have the same fire for the Lord as James did. He used to say that they were lost souls, but I never thought he meant it in the way it turned out. Did you ever witness anything that would suggest his relationship with them was more than just strict? The sheriff pressed, watching her closely for any signs of hesitation. Mrs. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't know what you're asking, Sheriff. James was a father. He wanted his sons to follow in his footsteps, to be strong, faithful men. But I never saw anything that would lead me to believe. She trailed off, her voice faltering. Thompson's instincts told him there was more she wasn't saying. Did James ever mention anything about the boys being involved in something unnatural? Janet's eyes widened in shock. What do you mean, unnatural? Anything that might have concerned him about their behavior? Things they were doing that didn't align with his beliefs? Thompson clarified. Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened, and she looked away. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. James would never say it outright, but I know he was worried about them. People in the congregation had been talking for months about how the boys were different. They didn't fit the mold James had created for them. There were rumors about them sneaking off, hanging around the wrong crowds. But it wasn't like James to go public with such things. He would just keep it all to himself and prey on it. Thompson's mind raced. The idea of the boys straying from their father's rigid expectations made sense, but he still needed more to connect the dots. The rumors of the boys' behavior were troubling, but they didn't explain the violence of what had happened. He thanked Mrs. Caldwell and left her home, his mind heavy with the weight of the conversation. Reverend Bennett's fears had clearly grown to obsession. But what was it that had pushed him over the edge? And what had the boys been hiding from their father and everyone else? Later that day, Thompson received a call from his forensic team. They had finished the preliminary autopsy reports on the boys, and the results were unsettling. Both teenagers, Derek and Elijah Bennett, had died from gunshot wounds, 3 shots each. The wounds were consistent with close-range shots, suggesting that the killings had been personal. But it wasn't the cause of death that had caught the sheriff's attention. It was the state of their bodies. The forensic pathologist had discovered something strange. Both boys had been subjected to severe bruising, indicating they had been physically assaulted before their deaths. The marks on their arms and legs suggested they had been restrained. This added a new layer of complexity to the case. If the boys had been held against their will, it seemed unlikely they had willingly participated in whatever was happening. The sheriff was left with more questions than answers. Was it possible that the boys had tried to fight back? Had they attempted to escape, only to be caught by their father? And why hadn't Bennett mentioned this during his confession? The deeper Thompson dug, the more he realized that the preacher's story didn't add up. There were too many inconsistencies, too many things left unspoken. It was becoming clear that Reverend Bennett wasn't the simple, devout father he had portrayed himself to be. He was hiding something darker, something that was not just about his faith or his son's behavior. It was about control and the lengths he would go to keep it. As the investigation unfolded, Sheriff Thompson found himself becoming increasingly disillusioned by the story he had once believed was a straightforward case of tragic paternal love gone wrong. It was anything but simple. Reverend Bennett had murdered his sons, yes, but the reasons behind it and the forces that had driven him to such an extreme were far more complicated. And now Thompson was determined to get to the bottom of it. But as he reviewed the evidence, one thing became clear. The investigation was about to take a sharp turn, one that would reveal the darkness hiding beneath the surface of the Bennett family's seemingly perfect life. The truth was out there, and Sheriff Thompson was going to find it, no matter where it led. As Sheriff Thompson walked back to his office that evening, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that the case was spiraling out of control. The more he uncovered, the more the story seemed to grow, twisting, contorting into something more complex and disturbing. Reverend James Bennett had murdered his 2 sons, but there was something else at play here, something that had remained hidden, even from the preacher himself. The bruises on Derek and Elijah's bodies suggested a struggle, and the restraint marks indicated that they hadn't been killed in a moment of blind rage. No, this was something more methodical, more premeditated. Reverend Bennett had likely spent days, if not weeks, working up to the moment of the murders. The pressure he had been building up in his mind had led him to the only logical conclusion in his twisted world. His sons were beyond redemption, and he had to put an end to their perceived sin. But Sheriff Thompson wasn't satisfied. The more he thought about Mrs. Caldwell's words, the more he wondered if there was something he was missing. The rumors about Derek and Elijah's behavior seemed to point in one direction, but it was still unclear exactly what had been happening in the Bennett household. Had the boys truly fallen off the path, as their father had claimed, or was there something else, something even more insidious, lurking in the background? That night, Thompson decided to revisit the home of the Bennett family. He needed to go over the evidence once more, searching for something, anything, that might reveal the truth. The house, now sealed off as a crime scene, was eerily quiet as he stepped through the front door. The air inside felt stale, as if it had been waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. As he made his way through the house, Thompson's eyes fell on the family photographs that lined the walls. In each image, Reverend Bennett stood tall and proud, a perfect family man with his wife and sons by his side. But the images felt hollow now, a facade that had crumbled beneath the weight of the tragedy. The family that had once seemed so perfect was now just another broken picture frame. In the boys' room, the sheriff once again scanned the space, hoping to find something new that might shed light on their lives. The room was immaculately tidy, too tidy for two teenage boys. The bed was neatly made, and there were no signs of the chaos that one might expect from two young men living under the same roof. Everything had been meticulously arranged, as if the boys had known their time was running out. Thompson's eyes landed on the dresser once more. The letter from the boys was still on his mind, but now something else caught his attention. A small, dusty photo album sat on top of the dresser, its cover worn with age. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to call to him. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages one by one. The first few pictures were the usual family snapshots, but as he moved deeper into the album, things began to shift. The later pages were filled with images of Derek and Elijah at church events, social gatherings, and family outings. But there was something different about these photos. They seemed staged, carefully posed in ways that felt too perfect. The boys looked happy, but there was a subtle tension in their eyes, a look that spoke of a family dynamic that was anything but perfect. It was as though they were playing a part for the camera, performing a role they had been forced into. Then something caught his eye, an image of the boys not smiling this time. In the photo, Derek and Elijah were standing together in what appeared to be the family's backyard. They were looking at each other, their faces serious. The background was blurry, but the look in their eyes was clear. This wasn't just a casual photo. This was a moment of shared understanding, a silent communication between the two of them. They were hiding something, and it was in that moment that Thompson realized they had been living a secret life, a life hidden from their father's prying eyes. The sheriff's heart raced as he stared at the photograph. What had the boys been hiding? What had they been so afraid to let their father see? And why had they felt the need to keep this secret from everyone? It was at that moment that Thompson's phone rang, breaking his train of thought. He answered it quickly, his voice low. "Sheriff Thompson, Sheriff, we've got something for you," came the voice of Deputy Miller. "We found something in the boys' room we didn't notice before, hidden under the floorboards." Thompson's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "It's a journal, a diary, actually," Miller replied. "We thought it was worth mentioning. The pages are worn, and it looks like it's been written in for a while." Thompson's mind raced. A journal? It could be the missing piece of the puzzle. He needed to see it. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up the phone. When Thompson arrived at the station, Deputy Miller was waiting for him with the journal in hand. The pages were worn, the ink faded in places, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was clear now. Derek and Elijah had been keeping a record of their lives, their thoughts and their fears. He flipped through the journal, his eyes scanning the entries. The first few pages were filled with mundane details, school assignments, plans with friends, everyday teenage concerns. But as he moved through the pages, the tone of the writing began to shift. There were references to secret meetings and late-night talks. As he read further, he found something that made his blood run cold. a confession from one of the boys about their father's increasing obsession with them. "He watches us more closely now," one of the entries read. "He thinks we're doing something wrong. I don't know what he means, but he's been talking more about sin, about the devil. He's making me scared." Another entry read, "We've been talking more. I don't know what's happening to me, but I don't want to disappoint him. He says he loves us, but we don't know what's going on in his head anymore." The sheriff's heart pounded in his chest. It was becoming clear that the boys had been afraid of their father. They had been living in fear of what he might do, and they had been trying to find a way to escape it. But there had been no escape. And in the end, Reverend Bennett had taken matters into his own hands. The journal was damning, but it also raised more questions. What had driven James Bennett to this point? Why had he become so obsessed with his sons, so consumed by his need to control them? And why had he believed that killing them was the only answer? Thompson closed the journal, his mind whirling with the new revelations. He wasn't any closer to understanding the preacher's true motivations. But one thing was clear: the Bennetts had been living a lie. And now the truth, however dark it may be, was finally starting to come to light. Sheriff Thompson knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The case had already shattered everything he thought he knew about the Bennett family, and he wasn't sure what else he would find as he continued digging. But one thing was certain: he was going to find the truth, no matter where it led. Sheriff Thompson sat in his office late into the night, his mind spinning with the information he had uncovered. The journal entries had given him new insight into the lives of Derek and Elijah, but they had also raised even more questions about the twisted dynamic in the Bennett household. The more he thought about it, the more it became apparent that the preacher's obsession with his sons was deeper and darker than anyone could have imagined. It was clear now that the murder of Derek and Elijah was not simply the tragic result of a father catching his sons in a compromising position. No, this was about control, about dominance, and about Reverend James Bennett's inability to see his sons as individuals separate from his own perception of righteousness. And now the full weight of the tragedy had come crashing down on the small Texas town. The sheriff had already spoken to several witnesses, neighbors, church members, and even a few of Bennett's closest friends. Each of them painted a picture of the preacher that was both contradictory and unsettling. Reverend Bennett had always been known as a man of God, a pillar of the community, someone people turned to for guidance and support. But beneath the surface, things were not as they seemed. One church member had mentioned that James had become increasingly distant in the months leading up to the murders, his sermons growing more erratic, more focused on sin and punishment than on love and redemption. Others had noted that he was spending more time alone in his study and that he seemed to be hiding something, but no one had any idea what was really going on behind closed doors. Now, with the journal in his hands, Sheriff Thompson had a deeper understanding of the terror that had been unfolding inside the Bennett home. The preacher's fear of the boys' perceived sin had taken on a life of its own, poisoning everything it touched. The journal entries revealed a young family torn apart by secrets, by fear, and by the suffocating control of a father who had lost touch with reality. But even with all this newfound knowledge, Thompson knew that it still wasn't enough. He needed to hear from James Bennett himself. The preacher was locked in the county jail awaiting trial, but Thompson wasn't sure if Bennett was ready to confess. From everything he had gathered, the man was delusional, convinced that his actions had been justified in the eyes of God. If Thompson was going to break through to him, he needed to approach it carefully. He needed to get inside the preacher's mind. The sheriff called in his trusted deputy, Miller, and briefed him on the situation. "I'm going to talk to Bennett," he said. "I need to hear it from him. I need him to explain himself." Deputy Miller nodded. "You sure you're ready for that, Sheriff?" Thompson hesitated, his fingers running over the worn edges of the journal in front of him. "No, I'm not ready, but I don't think I have a choice." The next morning, Sheriff Thompson made his way to the county jail. As he entered the small, dimly lit interrogation room, he was met by the cold, calculating stare of Reverend James Bennett. The preacher was sitting across from him, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in an orange jumpsuit now, no longer the proud, imposing figure he had once been. But there was still something about him, something dark and unyielding, that made Thompson's skin crawl. "Reverend Bennett," Thompson began, taking a seat across from the preacher, "I need you to tell me what happened. I need to understand why you did it." Bennett's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond right away. For a moment it seemed as though he wasn't even hearing the sheriff. Then finally he spoke in a low, almost reverent voice. "God works in mysterious ways," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who truly believed his actions were justified. "I was only doing what needed to be done. My sons, they were lost. They had fallen into temptation, into sin, and as their father, it was my duty to save them." Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't going to be easy. "You're telling me you killed your own sons because you thought they were sinful?" Bennett's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, they had strayed from the path. I caught them, together. That was the final straw. I knew then that they had fallen beyond redemption. The devil had gotten to them, and I had no choice but to do what was necessary." Thompson's mind raced. He had suspected that Bennett's view of his son's relationship had driven him to this point, but hearing it in his own words made it all the more horrifying. "You don't think you went too far? That maybe, just maybe, you could have helped them another way?" Bennett shook his head, his jaw tight with conviction. "I did what God called me to do. There was no other way. They were lost, Sheriff, and sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them go." Thompson felt his stomach churn. He had heard of twisted rationalizations before, but this was something else entirely. Reverend Bennett didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a savior, a righteous man doing God's work. He had convinced himself that his actions were justified, that he was eradicating evil from the world. For a moment, Thompson said nothing. He just sat there, staring at the preacher, trying to understand how a man could become so consumed by his own delusions. He knew that Bennett wasn't going to confess to murder, not in the way Thompson wanted him to, but there was one thing he could still use: the journal. "I have something here," Thompson said, pulling the worn journal from his bag and setting it down on the table in front of the preacher. "Your sons wrote this, and in it they describe their fear of you. They talk about how you started watching them more closely, how you began treating them like they were diseased." Bennett's eyes flickered again, this time with something resembling unease, but he quickly regained his composure, his face hardening. "You're twisting their words, Sheriff," Bennett spat. "They didn't understand. They were confused. But I was the one who loved them. I was the one who showed them the truth. They didn't see it then, but they would have. Eventually." Thompson leaned forward, locking eyes with Bennett. "What about the truth of their lives, of who they were? You couldn't accept them for who they were, could you?" Bennett fell silent for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. Finally he spoke, his voice a quiet whisper. "They were sinners, and I loved them too much to let them live in sin." Sheriff Thompson sat back in his chair, his mind working furiously. He had the confession, but it was a confession wrapped in delusion. Bennett wasn't going to be an easy man to break, but Sheriff Thompson had his own truth to uncover, and he wasn't going to stop until he got to the bottom of it. The investigation was far from over, but now Sheriff Thompson had one thing: the truth in all its darkness and complexity. The weeks following Sheriff Thompson's conversation with Reverend James Bennett were filled with tension. The small town of Benton Springs, Texas, was still reeling from the brutal murder of Derek and Elijah Bennett. News of the crime had spread quickly, drawing attention from local and national media. People were shocked, disturbed, and struggling to make sense of how such a tragedy could have occurred in their quiet community. Many had known the Bennetts for years, and the preacher's reputation as a man of God had made the murder even more incomprehensible. As the trial approached, the small-town courthouse became the center of activity. The prosecution was ready to put Reverend Bennett on trial for the murder of his two sons, and the defense was preparing to argue that the preacher had acted under the delusion that his actions were justified. Sheriff Thompson, who had worked tirelessly on the investigation, found himself deeply affected by the case. He had uncovered so many layers of darkness, and now it was time for the truth to come to light in a courtroom. On the day of the trial, the courthouse was packed with people, eager to hear the details of what had transpired behind closed doors in the Bennett household. Reverend Bennett sat in the defendant's chair, his face stoic, his eyes cold and distant. He looked like the same man who had once stood at the pulpit, preaching to his congregation about salvation and redemption, but now he was a far cry from the man who had once inspired so many. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Elizabeth Reed, stood tall and composed as she addressed the court. She was determined to see that justice was served for Derek and Elijah. She began by laying out the facts of the case. The bodies of the two young men had been discovered in their father's house, brutally murdered with a gunshot to each of their heads. The evidence pointed directly to Reverend Bennett. His fingerprints were found on the gun, and witnesses had seen him leaving the house the night of the murders. But it was the disturbing details of the investigation that would leave the deepest impression on the jury. As we have seen from the investigation, Elizabeth began, Reverend James Bennett killed his own sons. But this wasn't a moment of madness or a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was the culmination of months, possibly years, of psychological abuse, control, and manipulation. She paused, letting her words sink in. The victims, Derek and Elijah, were not only subjected to the fear and control of their father, but they were also deprived of their basic right to live as their authentic selves. The defendant believed his sons were sinful and beyond redemption. He convinced himself that he was doing God's will by taking their lives. But there is no justification for murder. Elizabeth's words resonated with the jury, and several of them exchanged looks, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust. As she continued to present the evidence, she painted a picture of a deeply disturbed father who had let his religious fervor spiral into delusion, who had twisted his love for his children into a dangerous obsession. The defense, led by attorney Thomas Green, argued that Reverend Bennett was not responsible for his actions. They claimed that the preacher had been so consumed by his belief that his sons had committed an unforgivable sin that he had lost touch with reality. According to Green, Bennett had acted out of a misguided sense of duty, believing that he was saving his sons from eternal damnation. We're not denying that Reverend Bennett took his sons' lives, Green said, his voice steady. But what we're asking is for the jury to understand that he did not act with malice. He acted under the delusion that he was saving them. This was a man so consumed by his faith, so desperate to rid his family of sin, that he believed in his heart that he was carrying out God's will. His mind was clouded by his religious convictions. The defense presented testimony from a psychologist who argued that Reverend Bennett had suffered from severe mental illness, leading him to commit the murders. They suggested that he had been unable to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the killings. But Sheriff Thompson, who had spent countless hours piecing together the events leading up to the murders, knew that there was more to the story than just a man acting out of delusion. He had seen the journal entries, read the letters, and listened to the witnesses who had described the oppressive atmosphere in the Bennett household. This wasn't a case of a man acting out of some divine calling. This was a case of a man using his religion as a weapon to control and dominate his children. The trial dragged on for several weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments and witnesses. As the days passed, Sheriff Thompson found himself growing more and more frustrated. He knew that the truth was clear, but he also knew how easily people could be swayed by the defense's arguments. Reverend Bennett had a powerful defense team, and they were doing everything they could to paint him as a man who had been pushed to the brink by his beliefs. But Thompson wasn't going to let that happen. He had seen too much. He knew the reality of what had happened. On the final day of the trial, the prosecution called Sheriff Thompson to the stand. As he made his way to the witness box, he felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the investigation anymore. This was about making sure that justice was served for Derek and Elijah, about ensuring that their voices were heard. Sheriff Thompson, Elizabeth Reed began, can you tell the jury what you discovered about Reverend Bennett's relationship with his sons leading up to the murders? Thompson took a deep breath and began to speak, recounting the disturbing details of the investigation. He spoke of the journal entries he had found, of the fear and manipulation that had permeated the Bennett household. He told the jury about the neighbors who had heard arguments, the church members who had noticed the preacher's increasing isolation, and the chilling words Reverend Bennett had used when he explained his actions. "The truth is," Thompson said, his voice steady but full of conviction, "Reverend Bennett did not act out of some divine sense of duty. He killed his sons because he couldn't accept them for who they were. He couldn't let go of the control he had over them. And in his twisted mind, he believed that killing them was the only way to save them." The room fell silent as Thompson's words hung in the air. The jury sat still, absorbing the weight of his testimony. He had painted a picture of a man who had crossed a line, a man who had let his beliefs morph into something dangerous and destructive. This wasn't about redemption. This was about the cold, calculated actions of a man who had justified murder in the name of his faith. The deliberations were quick. The jury came back with a unanimous verdict. Reverend James Bennett was guilty of the murders of Derek and Elijah Bennett. The courtroom was filled with a sense of relief, but also an overwhelming sadness. The lives of two young men had been stolen, and a family had been destroyed. There would be no happy ending, no redemption. There would only be the haunting reminder of what had transpired behind closed doors. As the gavel came down, Sheriff Thompson stood up and left the courtroom, his heart heavy. He had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a cost. The murder of Derek and Elijah Bennett was a tragedy that would never be forgotten, not in Benton Springs, and not in the hearts of those who had fought for justice. The town would heal, but the scars would remain forever.